On the afternoon of the 6th of May, 1910, a 42-year-old woman in a long, dark coat arrived at the side entrance of Buckingham Palace. She was carrying a letter the king had written to her 9 years earlier, on the day he came to the throne. In the letter, he had promised that if he were ever taken seriously ill, she would be sent for. She handed the letter to the Queen, his wife, and the Queen read it in silence. Then she allowed her into the room where her husband was dying. The woman with the letter was not the Queen. She was Alice Keppel. If stories like this are what you watch this channel for, the quiet ones, the buried ones, the ones the official histories tidy away, then take a second now and subscribe. I have more of them coming, and I want you here when they do. Chapter 1. The Castle. The King Gave Away. Before Alice Keppel ever met a prince, she lived inside a building that a Scottish king had once given away as a wedding present. Duntreath Castle stands in Stirlingshire, in a green valley north of Glasgow. It is a fortified tower house with thick stone walls and small deep windows. King Robert III of Scotland gave it as a wedding gift to his daughter Mary Stuart in the year 1425. She married Sir William Edmonstone, and from that year forward, the castle stayed in one family. 500 years of children grew up inside its walls. One of them was Alice. She was born on the 29th of April, 1868, in Woolwich, on the south bank of the Thames. Her father was Admiral Sir William Edmonstone, 4th Baronet of Duntreath. Her mother was Mary Elizabeth Parsons. Alice was the youngest of 9 surviving children. She had 8 older sisters. She was, by every account, the prettiest of them. The world she grew up in was old. The castle had a long ground floor hall with a fireplace big enough for a child to stand inside. The bedrooms upstairs had iron bedsteads and washstands and embroidered samplers on the walls. The gardens stretched for acres, with old yew trees and a stretch of river. The Edmonstones were not rich. They were what the English call landed gentry. They had a castle. They had a baronetcy. They did not have much cash. That distinction matters. Most viewers picture aristocratic childhoods as a haze of velvet and silver. The reality, for the daughters of a Scottish baronet with 8 older sisters, was patched gowns, careful housekeeping, and a polite anxiety about who would marry whom. The Edmonstones had paid for the castle's long restoration in the 1860s and 1870s. The architect was Charles Wilson of Glasgow. The work had taken decades. The bills had been heavy. But the family had something more useful than ready money. It had assurance. 500 years of being the people the king had given a castle to produces a particular kind of confidence. It is the confidence that does not have to be performed. Alice carried it from the schoolroom at Duntreath into every London drawing room she ever entered. She did not need to convince anyone she belonged. She had been told by silent inheritance every day of her childhood that she did. She was quick. She was musical. She had a low, soft voice that Sir Harold Acton would later call the most expensive sound in Edwardian London. She was tall, with chestnut hair and a clear, unhurried gaze. By the time she was 20, she was the most striking of the 8 Edmonstone daughters, and the family understood, without saying so, that her future was the family's chance to climb. 8 daughters meant 8 dowries. 8 dowries from a baronet's modest estate meant small ones. Alice would have to marry. She would have to marry well. She would have to do it on the strength of her face and her manner alone, because her bank balance would not be doing any of the work. What does that kind of childhood do to a girl? It makes her watchful. It makes her practical. It teaches her to read a room before she enters it. It teaches her the value of silence over speech. It produces, in the right kind of mind, the exact instrument the Edwardian court would later require. The Scottish castle gave her the inheritance. The 8 older sisters gave her the calculation. By the time she came down to London for her first season, in the late 1880s, she had both. She was not famous yet. She was a Scottish baronet's youngest daughter at a London ball. Nobody who watched her dance that season could have guessed that within 20 years she would be the woman that prime ministers contacted to reach the king. Chapter 2. The husband who could never afford her. In June 1891, she walked down the aisle in a London church to marry a man whose army pay would not cover the cost of her wardrobe. The man was the Honourable George Keppel. He was 27. She was 23. The wedding was on the 1st of June, 1891. The bride wore white. The groom wore the dress uniform of the Gordon Highlanders. George Keppel was the 3rd son of William Coates Keppel, 7th Earl of Albemarle. 3rd sons of earls inherit nothing. They get a name, a connection, a place in the family pew at the parish church, and a polite expectation that they will go quietly into the army or the church or the law and not embarrass anyone. George chose the army. He was a lieutenant. His pay was around £120 a year. In the money of today, that is roughly £18,000. It was enough for bachelor lodgings and a horse. It was not enough for a wife with 8 older sisters' worth of social ambition. The Keppels began their marriage in a small house in Wilton Crescent in Belgravia. They moved soon to 27 Portman Square. Then, in 1899, they moved one door to 30 Portman Square, which was bigger. The arithmetic of these moves did not add up. George was still a serving officer. His pay had not changed. Alice had no fortune of her own, and yet the houses kept getting larger. This is the part of the story that the polite biographies pass over fast. Alice was beautiful, and beautiful women in the late Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy had a quiet career path. They could marry once, marry well, and use the marriage as the platform from which a longer and more interesting life would be conducted. The marriage did not have to be a romance. It had to be a partnership. It had to be a deal. George Keppel was the right kind of husband for that deal. He was charming. He was warm. He was discreet. He liked Alice deeply and admired her openly. He had no illusion that he could keep her on his own. He once said of her, in the hearing of friends, that he did not mind what she did, so long as she came back to him in the end. That sentence has been quoted by every historian who has touched the marriage. It is the single most concise piece of evidence we have for what kind of arrangement this was. They had 2 daughters. Violet was born on the 6th of June, 1894. Sonia Rosemary was born on the 24th of May, 1900. Both were officially George's children. London gossip later insisted that Sonia was the king's. The family closed ranks. The girls grew up calling George their father. Sonia, in her own memoirs much later in life, described her parents' marriage as a marriage of companionship, of love and laughter. The phrase was deliberate. It was true on its own terms. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth is that George Keppel agreed, by some unspoken treaty negotiated between them and the world they lived in, to be the husband Alice needed in public. He went on the family holidays. He posed for the family photographs. He raised the daughters. He left the house when the Prince of Wales arrived. He took a sinecure at the firm of Lipton, the tea merchants, on which his official duties were vague and his salary was very real. He never publicly complained. He never wrote a memoir. He died 10 weeks after Alice, in November 1947, and was buried beside her in Florence. What kind of man marries a woman like that? The honest answer is that a man like George Keppel did. a younger son of an earl with no fortune and no career prospects, had limited options. He could go to India, he could marry a colliery heiress, or he could marry a beautiful, clever Scottish girl who clearly intended to climb, and he could climb with her. He chose the third option. He kept his side of the bargain for 56 years. He was not the comic figure that some later writers have made him. He was not the cuckolded fool. He was a working partner in a long and quietly successful enterprise. He understood the rules from the beginning. He never broke them. By his quietness, he kept her safe. By his absence at the right moments, he made her possible. Chapter 3. The Dinner That Changed England. In February 1898, at a dinner in a London townhouse, a 56-year-old prince looked across the table at a 29-year-old soldier's wife. The townhouse belonged to Lord and Lady Howe. The prince was Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Queen Victoria, heir to the British throne, by then the most photographed and most discussed man in Europe. He was sometimes known as Bertie. He was overweight. He was bored. He was tired. He had been the Prince of Wales for 56 years and counting. Alice Keppel sat across the table from him in a dress whose colour the surviving accounts do not specify. What is recorded is the moment of recognition. He looked at her. She looked back. Within weeks, she was his. The relationship that started that month would last 12 years. It would survive the death of Queen Victoria in January 1901. It would survive his accession as King Edward VII, his coronation in 1902, his reign, his bronchitis, his constitutional crises, and his deepening melancholy. It would only end with his death in May 1910. Nothing else broke it. Not gossip, not his other women, not his wife, not the political opposition, not the press. The early months were arranged with the quiet efficiency that had defined the prince's personal life for decades. He had had mistresses before. He had a system. Letters were sent through trusted intermediaries. Visits were timed for the late afternoon. The husband was always elsewhere. The household understood without instruction what was required of them. What was new with Alice was the pace at which she became the only one. The prince had previously kept his mistresses in rotation. Lily Langtry, the actress from Jersey, had been the favourite from 1877. Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, had been the favourite from around 1889. There had been others. Alice arrived in 1898. Within 18 months, she had eclipsed all of them. Within 3 years, she was the only one that mattered. The move from 27 to 30 Portman Square in 1899 marked the formal arrival. The new house was a 4-storey Georgian townhouse of pale brick and Portland stone. It had 3 windows wide across the front. It had a black and white marble entrance hall, a dining room behind, a butler's pantry beyond, and on the first floor, the principal drawing room running the full width of the house with a smaller drawing room behind. The first floor was where the visits took place. The Prince of Wales came in the late afternoon. He would arrive by carriage at first, and later by motor car. He would enter through the front door. He would be shown directly upstairs. Tea would be brought. The hostess would dismiss the staff. The doors would close. What happened next did not generate paperwork. It generated an arrangement. The arrangement was that this woman, this house, this drawing room, was now part of the prince's daily existence. He came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He came when he was tired. He came when he was in London. He came when he wanted to talk to someone who did not want anything from him. That last clause is the key to the entire 12-year story. The Prince of Wales had been pursued by women, by ministers, by ambassadors, by financiers, by relatives, and by family friends every day of his adult life. They all wanted something. Alice Keppel, by some genius of temperament, learned very early not to want anything from him. She did not ask for jewels. She did not ask for honours for her relatives. She did not ask for shares. She did not ask for a title. The jewels came anyway. The shares came anyway. The careful financial arrangements made through Sir Ernest Cassel came anyway. They came because they were not asked for. The prince was so accustomed to being asked for things that the absence of the request created the response. He gave her what she did not ask him for, and he gave her more of it than he had given anyone else. By the time Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January, 1901, the relationship was 3 years old and unbreakable. Albert Edward became King Edward VII. Alice Keppel became the maîtresse en titre of the new Edwardian age. The court circular would not use the phrase. The court understood it perfectly. The world she would dominate for the next 9 years was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Drawing Room with the Closed Door. At 30 Portman Square, every afternoon at a certain hour, the household understood without being told that the front door was no longer to be opened. The hour was around 4 o'clock. The carriage had arrived in the side street. The prince, now the king, had been shown upstairs. The butler stood in the marble hall in his black coat and waited. Visitors who appeared after 4 o'clock were turned away with an apology. The household ran on a system of quiet times and louder times. The quiet times were the king's. To understand how the household worked, you have to walk through it. The house at 30 Portman Square was a 4-story Georgian townhouse over a basement. The basement held the kitchens, the scullery, the larder, the servants' hall, the housekeeper's room, the butler's pantry, and the male servant bedrooms. The ground floor held the entrance hall, the morning room, the dining room, and the back stairs. The first floor held the principal drawing room and the smaller drawing room behind. The second floor held the principal bedrooms. The third floor and the attics held the children's nurseries and the rooms of the upper female servants. The staff was structured by a hierarchy as rigid as anything in the British Army. At the top was the butler, who controlled the silver, the wine, the male servants, and the front of the house. Below him was the housekeeper, who controlled the female servants, the linen, the stores, and the back of the house. Below them was the chef, who controlled the kitchen. Below the chef was the lady's maid, who served Alice directly, and the valet, who served George. Below them came the under-butler, then the first footman, then the second footman, then the housemaids, then the kitchen maids, then the scullery maids. At the bottom was the hall boy. Each level had its own dining table, its own routine, and its own quiet snobberies. The wages can still be reconstructed from contemporary domestic service manuals. An experienced butler in a Mayfair house in the year 1900 earned between £80 and £100 a year, with full room and board. In the money of today, that is around £12,000. A housekeeper earned about £50. A first footman earned between £30 and £40. A scullery maid earned between £10 and £15 a year, and slept in a basement room. The total wage bill at 30 Portman Square in the year 1905 has been estimated by historians at well over £2,000, perhaps the equivalent of £300,000 today. The kitchen ran for 16 hours a day. The cook was up before 5 in the morning to start the ranges. Breakfast for the family was served at 9. Breakfast for the upper servants was served at 8. Breakfast for the lower servants was served at 7. Lunch followed at 1. Tea followed at 4. Dinner followed at 8. When the king was expected, the kitchen ran a second sequence on top of the first. The chef would be told which French dishes were required. The order would go out to Fortnum and Mason for the foie gras. The order would go out to the great fishmongers and game dealers of Mayfair for the fish and the game. A second small supper would be prepared, set out in the small dining room behind a screen of palms, and served on the king's own preferred china. The discretion required of every member of this household was absolute and unwritten. The butler did not record the king's visits. The footman did not gossip in the public houses. The housemaids did not write to their mothers in the country about what they had seen. The lady's maid did not speak to journalists. In the entire 12 years of the king's visits to 30 Portman Square, there is not a single recorded leak from a member of the Keppel household staff. Not one. That is an astonishing statistic. It is the single best surviving evidence of the gravitational pull of the Keppel household discipline, because there is a darker corollary to all of this hidden infrastructure. The servants at 30 Portman Square were not paid more than the servants at any other Mayfair house. They were not given particular bonuses. They were not given particular privileges. They were given the same wages and the same conditions as every other domestic in London. And yet they kept the secret. Why? The answer is the architecture of Edwardian service. A scullery maid who left 30 Portman Square with a reputation for indiscretion would never work in another good house again. A footman who spoke to a journalist would be blacklisted across Mayfair within a week. The references the housekeeper wrote, the references the butler wrote, the quiet conversations between butlers across the square, were the entire economic future of every servant in the house. They kept the secret because the secret was attached to their bread. The drawing room that the king visited each afternoon was upholstered in heavy silk damask in a deep rose colour. The carpets were Persian. The furniture was a mixture of English 18th century and French Louis XV and Louis XVI, the styles the king favoured above all others. Family photographs in silver frames stood on every surface. Fabergé animals in jade and rose quartz stood in glass cabinets. Orchids in silver tubs sat on the mantelpieces. The curtains were drawn against the daylight. The lighting was kept low. The room was warm and slow and quiet. This was the room in which, on certain afternoons, the King of England, the man whose chest weight and emphysema would eventually kill him, found the one place in his kingdom where he could sit, drink tea, smoke his cigars, and not be asked for anything. That is what Alice Keppel had built. That is what the household enforced. That is what the basement kitchens, the underpaid housemaids, the silent butler, and the husband who had conveniently left the house were all in place to protect. It was not love. It was not, in the sentimental sense, an affair. It was an installation. The drawing room was the room in which the most powerful man in Europe was allowed, for 1.5 hours, twice a week, to stop being him. Chapter 5. The money that did not officially exist. George Keppel's army pay would not have rented their drawing room curtains, and yet the house ran on a scale to rival a duke's. The numbers do not work. They never worked. From the moment of the wedding in 1891 to the king's death in May 1910, the Keppel household expenditure exceeded the Keppel household official income by a factor of at least 5. Somebody was paying. The interesting question is who and how the payment was disguised. Start with the gifts. The Prince of Wales, even before he became king, gave Alice Keppel a continuous stream of jewellery. There was a Fabergé cigarette case in gold and enamel. There was a set of antique snuff boxes set with diamonds, originally purchased by Catherine the Great for her own household. There was an emerald and diamond pendant of 3 large emeralds set in diamond clusters, which contemporary insurance valuations put at £500 in the year 1900. There were strings of pearls. There were diamond brooches in the shape of stars and feathers. By the time of the king's death, Alice's jewellery collection was reckoned among the finest in private hands in London, outside the great ducal families. But jewels are not money. They are objects. They can be sold. But selling them generates a paper trail and a London society scandal. The serious money came through a different mechanism, and the mechanism was the king's financier, Sir Ernest Cassel. Cassel was a German-born financier who had become indispensable to the Prince of Wales during the 1880s. By the early 1900s, he was the king's principal private investment advisor, the man who arranged the discreet share purchases, the discreet bond placements, and the discreet redistribution of capital that allowed the king to maintain his personal household at the level he required. Cassel had a method. The prince would mention a name. Cassel would arrange for that name to receive an allocation of shares in one of the great new ventures of the period. The shares would be issued at a price below their initial market trading level. The recipient would sell the shares in the open market after a respectable interval. The cash difference was the gift, dressed as an investment return. Alice Keppel received this treatment for years. The shares are scattered through the surviving records. There were holdings in the Mexican Eagle Petroleum Company, a major Anglo-Mexican oil venture of the early 1900s. There were holdings in a rubber concern in the Federated Malay States. There were holdings in several of the new South African mining companies. The total dividend stream from these holdings, by the year 1907, has been estimated at between £2,000 and £3,000 a year, perhaps the equivalent of £300,000 to £400,000 in current money. That income was paid into Alice's own bank account at Coutts. It was hers, in her own name, separate from George's. Then there was George's own income. He was a serving officer until the early 1900s, after which he resigned his commission. He took up a position at the firm of Lipton, the Glasgow grocers, owned by Sir Thomas Lipton, the yachting friend of the king. The position carried a substantial salary. The official duties were vague. Lipton himself was a regular guest at 30 Portman Square. The arrangement is one of the clearest examples in the surviving Edwardian record of what historians now call a hospitality salary. George was being paid for being George, and for not being in the house in the late afternoon. The total picture, by the year 1907 or so, was this. The Keppels had an official income between George's pay, his Lipton salary, and his small inherited interest of perhaps £2,500 a year. They had an unofficial income through Alice's investment dividends of perhaps a further £3,000. Their actual annual expenditure on the London house, the staff, the entertaining, the wardrobes, the holidays at Marienbad and Biarritz, the visits on the Royal Yacht Britannia and the children's nursery, has been estimated at between £8,000 and £10,000. The remaining gap was filled by capital gifts, by direct cash transfers from Cassel through clearing accounts, and by the systematic absorption of household expenses by the king's own household whenever they travelled together. The capital that Alice accumulated through all of this was the foundation of the rest of her life. By the king's death in May 1910, historians estimate she had between £50,000 and £100,000 of capital under her own control, the equivalent of between £6 and £12 million today. That capital was what paid for the world tour after the king's death. It was what paid for the years in the south of France. It was what bought the Villa dell'Ombrellino in Florence in 1925. It was what kept her in the Ritz Hotel through the Second World War. It was what allowed her to die in 1947, still surrounded by orchids and silver photographs in a Tuscan villa. She never spoke about any of it in public. She never wrote a memoir. She never gave an interview on any subject. She was, in the matter of her own finances, as in the matter of her own private life, completely and incorruptibly silent. The accounts were closed. The investments were quiet. The shares were held in her name. The cash flowed through Coutts. The king paid. The world did not ask. The arrangement worked. What does this tell us about the actual economy of Edwardian royal favour? It tells us that the relationship between the crown and its favourites in this period was not a romantic one. It was financial. It was structured. It was professional. It was the business of being the woman the king was visiting, and the business was paid like any other business, through indirect mechanisms, by trusted intermediaries, on terms designed to leave no awkward paperwork. Alice Keppel was, in addition to everything else she was, a small private enterprise. The enterprise's product was the king's afternoon ease. The enterprise's customer was the king. The enterprise's accountant was Sir Ernest Cassel. The enterprise made its proprietor independently wealthy for the rest of her life. Chapter 6. The Telegraph Wire to the Crown. By 1905, the Foreign Office had quietly accepted that the surest way to reach the king's ear was through a chestnut-haired woman in Mayfair. The fact was not formally recorded. It was understood. The senior permanent officials of the Foreign Office, the senior figures in the Liberal Party, the senior figures in the Conservative Party, the senior figures in the royal household, and a small number of foreign ambassadors, all understood that the king was a difficult man to brief. He resented being briefed. He thought he had been briefed enough already. He was tired. He was impatient. He had been excluded from state papers for the entire 50 years of his mother's reign, and now that he had them, he did not necessarily want to read them. But he would talk to Mrs. Keppel. He would talk to her in the drawing room at 30 Portman Square in the late afternoon. He would talk to her in the carriage on the way to a country house weekend. He would talk to her on the deck of the royal yacht Britannia. He would talk to her over breakfast at Sandringham. He would talk to her in the gardens at the Hôtel du Palais in Biarritz in March. And what he heard her say, in that low, slow chestnut voice, he would sometimes act on. That was the channel. That was what the Foreign Office had spotted by 1905. The mechanism was elegant. A senior official, frustrated by the king's resistance to a particular line of policy, would arrange to be invited to the same country house party. He would find a moment to speak to Mrs. Keppel. He would lay out the issue in plain words, with a small handful of clarifying facts. He would not lobby her. He would not ask her to lobby the king. He would simply describe the question and then change the subject. He would not see her again that weekend. What happened next varied. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes, 3 or 4 days later, the king would mention to his private secretary that he had been thinking about the Persian Gulf question, or the Russian Convention, or the question of the German naval estimates, and that perhaps he had been too quick to dismiss the Foreign Office line. The private secretary would record the change of view in the official files. The Foreign Office would receive a more cooperative king. Mrs. Keppel would not be mentioned. The mechanism worked. The Viceroy of India, Lord Hardinge of Penshurst, who served the king first at the Foreign Office and then in India, later wrote in his memoirs that on 1 or 2 occasions when the king was at variance with the Foreign Office, he had been able, through Mrs. Keppel, to bring the king round to the line of the government. He was the only senior official ever to record the fact in print. Others knew it. None of them wrote it down at the time. The political range of the Channel was wider than the foreign policy file alone. Alice Keppel had grown into her role across the 7 years between the king's accession and the height of the Liberal government's reform agenda. She had become a Liberal hostess in her own right. She had close working friendships with Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, the Liberal Prime Minister from December 1905, and later with Herbert Henry Asquith, his successor from April 1908. She had a close working friendship with Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary across both ministries. She had a close working friendship with Sir John Fisher, the First Sea Lord, who reshaped the Royal Navy in the years before the First World War. She did not produce paper. She did not write memoranda. She did not make speeches. She talked. She listened. She remembered what she had been told. She presented the right point at the right time, in the right tone, in a way calibrated for a tired 60-year-old king who did not want to be lectured. She knew when to drop a subject. She knew when to come back to it the next afternoon. She knew when not to mention it at all. The court calendar moved on a rhythm she could predict. Winter and early spring in London. Late winter in Cannes, where the king kept a regular party. Early spring in Biarritz, where the king kept a regular party at the Hôtel du Palais. Summer at Marienbad in Bohemia, the spa town where the king took his annual cure for his weight and his bronchitis. August at Cowes for the regatta and the royal yacht. September at Balmoral. October and November at Sandringham. December at Windsor. From 1906 onward, Alice and her daughters, Violet and Sonia, travelled to Biarritz each spring. They were not formally part of the royal party. They were always in the next villa. The girls remembered for the rest of their lives the king swimming in the sea at 67, with the wind blowing his moustache flat. The court circular reported these movements in a polite code. The phrase, "the king is visiting his friends, Mr. and Mrs. Keppel," used several times a year in the Times in the years before 1910, meant something specific to every well-informed reader in London. The phrase was repeated without inflection. The inflection lay in the absence of further detail. This is what set Alice Keppel apart from every previous royal mistress in modern British history. Lily Langtry had been an actress, photographed, talked about, paid for by trinkets and houses bought in her own name, a public figure who courted publicity. Daisy Warwick, Countess of Warwick, had been a wealthy society hostess in her own right, but she had been so indiscreet about her affair with the prince that her own nickname in the smart set had been the Babbling Brook. Both had been Edward's mistresses. Neither had been part of his government. Alice was part of his government. The government did not call it that. The government did not have to. By the autumn of 1909, the Channel was at its peak. Asquith was in office. The people's budget was passing through the Commons. The Lords were resisting. The constitutional crisis was deepening. The king was caught between a Liberal cabinet, pushing the budget through, and a House of Lords, full of his old friends, voting it down. He could not sleep. He could not breathe properly. His bronchitis was worsening. His weight was killing him. He was 67 years old and visibly failing. In the afternoons at 30 Portman Square in the autumn of 1909, the king would sit in his customary chair beside the fire. He would smoke his cigar. He would drink his tea. He would listen to a woman whose chestnut hair was beginning to grey at the temples. He would talk about the Lords. He would talk about Asquith. He would talk about the Dreadnought programme. And outside the drawing room, in the next floor up, the daughters Violet, aged 15, and Sonia, aged 9, were doing their lessons with the governess. The king's reign had 8 months left. Chapter 7. The King Who Could Not Climb the Stairs. In the spring of 1910, the king returned from Biarritz already ill, and inside 3 weeks he could no longer climb a single flight of stairs. He had been at the Hôtel du Palais on the French Atlantic coast from the 7th of March. He was supposed to be taking the cure. He was supposed to be losing weight. He was supposed to be giving his lungs the sea air. None of it worked. He returned to London on the 27th of April. He was 68. He had 8 more days to live. The biological collapse had been a long time coming. Edward VII smoked 12 cigars a day. He ate 5 large meals a day. He drank champagne and brandy in volumes that would have killed a younger man. His chest measurement, by the last year of his life, was 54 inches around. His weight had passed 16 stone. His lungs were full of bronchitis from the cigars and the London winters. His heart had been straining for years. He had spasms of breathlessness that doctors at the time called angina pectoris, and now would simply call coronary disease. He could not walk up a hill. He could not bend to tie his shoes. He could not climb a staircase without resting halfway. He insisted on continuing to work. On the 2nd of May, he attended a performance at the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden. He sat in the royal box. He coughed throughout the performance. People in the boxes either side commented to one another that the king looked ill. On the 4th of May, he returned to Buckingham Palace from Sandringham. He had wanted to stay in Norfolk. His doctors had insisted on London. He arrived at the palace exhausted. On the morning of the 6th of May, he was already very weak. He had bronchitis. He had a fever. He could not lie down without coughing. He sat in an armchair by the window in his bedroom. He insisted on receiving his friend, Sir Ernest Cassel, for a short interview about a financial matter. He insisted on being told the cricket score from the Surrey match. He insisted on going down to the smoking room for a cigar. At lunchtime, he ate a few mouthfuls of food. By the early afternoon, he was barely conscious. By 3 o'clock, his private secretary, Lord Knollys, had sent for the Queen. By 3:30, Queen Alexandra had reached his bedroom. By 4 o'clock, the king had suffered a major heart attack. He fell back in his chair. He could not speak. He could not see clearly. He was dressed by his valet in a clean shirt and helped onto the bed. He rallied briefly. He recognized the Queen. He recognized his son, George, the Prince of Wales. He recognized his daughter, Princess Victoria. He did not recognize some of the others in the room. He had another heart attack. He fell back again. The royal household began the ritual of a king's death. The Archbishop of Canterbury was sent for. The senior court physicians were sent for. The cabinet was informed. The Prime Minister, Mr. Asquith, was at sea on a return voyage from Gibraltar. The constitutional question of who could legally accept the king's death was raised quietly and then put aside. Telegrams went out to the palaces of Europe. At some point in the late afternoon, the king, lying on his bed, his breathing now very poor, spoke a few words to his son. He asked about a horse that was running in the Kempton Park Plate that afternoon. The horse was called Witch of the Air. It belonged to the king. It had won the race. The Prince of Wales told him so. The king is reported to have said, "I am very glad." He never spoke clearly again. It was at this point in the afternoon, with the king now sinking, that the Queen sent for Alice Keppel. That is the moment at which the entire 12-year arrangement was suddenly forced into the light. For 12 years, the King and Mrs. Keppel had managed their relationship through a strict architecture of discretion. The drawing room, the closed door, the court circular code, the basement kitchen, the husband who left the house, the servants who kept the secret, the shares held quietly through Cassel. The system had worked because everyone agreed not to look at it. Now, on the afternoon of the 6th of May, the system was about to be tested at the only point at which it could not be hidden. The king was dying. Mrs. Keppel had been promised, in a letter written 9 years earlier, that she would be summoned to his side. The Queen, his wife, would have to decide whether to honour that promise. The newspapers were already gathering in the street outside the palace. What the Queen did next is the part of the story that defines her as much as it defines Alice. Chapter 8. The Letter. She brought to the palace. She kept the letter in a drawer for 9 years, hoping she would never have to use it, and on the afternoon of the 6th of May, she put it in her bag. The letter had been written in 1901, in the first weeks of the king's reign, in the king's own hand. In it, he had promised that if he were ever taken seriously ill, she was to be sent for. He had asked her to keep the letter safe and to bring it with her on the day. He had told her that the Queen had been informed of his wishes. The Queen had been told something. What exactly she had been told, and how clearly, no surviving document records. What is certain is that on the afternoon of the 6th of May, when Alice Keppel arrived at the side entrance of Buckingham Palace at around 4 o'clock, she was admitted by a royal household official without difficulty. She was shown to an anteroom on the 2nd floor. She was asked to wait. The Queen had been with the dying king for most of the afternoon. She had sat by the bed. She had spoken to him. She had held his hand. She was 65 years old. She had borne him 5 children. She had endured his mistresses for 47 years. She had endured them with a kind of Scandinavian stoicism that her biographers have always struggled to explain. Now her husband was dying in front of her, and a 42-year-old woman was waiting in an anteroom with a letter from him. A royal household equerry brought the letter to the Queen. She read it in silence. She did not speak for some minutes. Then she made the decision that she would be remembered for. She allowed Alice Keppel into the room. There are 2 surviving versions of what happened next, and they contradict each other on every important point. The first version is the one passed down through Alice's own family. In this version, Alice entered the bedroom in a state of quiet self-command. She approached the bed. She knelt beside it. The king, still semi-conscious, recognized her. He took her hand. He spoke to her. He thanked her for coming. The Queen stood at the other side of the bed and made no objection. The 2 women parted with a quiet nod. Alice left the room. Some hours later, the king died. The second version is the one given by the senior court official Lord Esher in his confidential memoranda, and corroborated in part by Queen Alexandra's biographer, Georgina Batiscombe. In this version, Alice entered the bedroom already in distress. She approached the bed. The king was barely conscious. He did not clearly recognize her. She became hysterical. She made a noise that disturbed the room. The Queen, after some minutes of this, hissed quietly to a doctor. "Get that woman away." 2 members of the royal household took Alice gently by the arms and escorted her out. She was taken back to the anteroom. She wept for some time. She was then driven back to Portman Square. What is not in dispute is the basic sequence. She arrived. She was admitted. She entered the room. She was removed from the room. She left the palace. The king died at 11:45 that night, with the Queen at his side. What was happening in this hour, for those of us trying to understand it now, was not just the death of a king. It was the public collision of 2 systems. On one side was the constitutional system of marriage and crown, embodied by the Queen, his wife of 47 years, mother of his children, the woman the British public expected to find at his side at the end. On the other side was the informal system of Edwardian aristocratic favour, embodied by Alice, the chestnut-haired companion of the king's last 12 years, the woman the king himself had insisted, in writing, was to be present. Both systems had a legitimate claim. The constitutional one would always be the one the official histories recorded. The informal one had been the daily reality of the king's life. The Queen, by admitting Alice for those few minutes, acknowledged both. By removing her before the end, she protected the constitutional one. It was an act of immense self-control. Alice's own behaviour at the bedside, depending on which version one believes, was either the dignified silence of the woman the king had loved, or the breakdown of a woman who knew her world was ending. Probably both versions are partly true. She had been at his side, in one capacity or another, for 12 years. She had been promised, in writing, that she would be present at the end. She had brought the letter. She had been admitted, and then she had been removed. She went home to Portman Square in the late afternoon. She did not appear in public for several weeks. She gave no interview. She wrote no statement. She made no claim of any kind to any newspaper, then or later. The discretion that had defined the entire 12 years held to the end and beyond. She never spoke about the deathbed scene in public, not once, for the next 37 years of her life. The Queen, for her part, did something similar. She never spoke publicly about Alice. She made no statement. She corrected no version. She sealed the room. The two women never met again. By a quiet agreement, which neither of them could ever have signed, they both decided that the silence around what had happened in that bedroom was more important than any version of it. Edward VII was buried at Windsor on the 20th of May, 1910. Alice Keppel did not attend the funeral. She watched the procession from a closed carriage in the Mall. She left London the next morning. Her 12-year career as the King's friend had ended. Chapter 9. The New King Who Wanted Her Gone. Within weeks of his father's funeral, the new king made quietly clear to a small circle that the world his father had built around Mrs. Keppel was over. King George V was 45 years old. He had been the Duke of York and then the Prince of Wales. He was a man of plain habits, plain pleasures, and plain views. He was deeply devoted to his wife, Mary of Teck, who would become Queen Mary. He had been a serving naval officer for most of his adult life. He had no time for the Edwardian smart set, no time for his father's financial friends, and no time for the women who had filled his father's afternoons. He made his views known through the usual quiet channels. His private secretary, Lord Knollys, who had served the old king, was told that certain figures from the previous court would no longer be received. The list was not published. It did not have to be. The men and women on it understood within days that they had been moved off the list. Alice Keppel was not specifically named. She did not have to be. The arrangement she had had with King Edward had depended entirely on his daily presence in her drawing room. With him gone, there was no arrangement. She was no longer the friend of the king. She was the widow of his memory. She did the only sensible thing. In November 1910, 6 months after the king's death, she and George left London on a long world tour. The tour took them to Ceylon, where George had connections through the tea trade and the Lipton firm. From Ceylon, they went to China. From China, they went to Japan. From Japan, they crossed the Pacific to the United States. They were away for nearly 2 years. The tour served two purposes. The first was personal. It removed Alice from the daily round of London society at the moment when the new court was being formed. It put a continent between her and the rooms in which George V's preferences were being established. The second purpose was strategic. It gave the British establishment time to forget her. When she returned to London in late 1912, she was no longer the king's friend, the king's mistress, or the king's anything. She was a wealthy, aristocratic widow of his memory, which was a very different thing to be. The new court could ignore her. Polite society could receive her. The newspapers had moved on. The king was dead. The Edwardian period had ended. The Georgian one had begun. Mrs. Keppel was history. She did not retreat. She did not weep in public. She did not write a self-pitying letter to a single one of her friends, so far as any surviving correspondence shows. She rebuilt her life on its new terms. She maintained a London house. She entertained at it. She took an apartment in Paris for the autumn. She took a villa in the south of France for the winter. She continued, year after year, the polite and gracious round of an aristocratic widow of independent means. She was always immaculately dressed. She was always perfectly polite. She never mentioned the deathbed. She never mentioned the letter. She never mentioned the king. The years from 1912 to 1924 were the long, quiet middle. Her elder daughter, Violet, grew up into a clever, restless, troubled woman who was about to fall into a long, scandalous love affair with the writer Vita Sackville West. Her younger daughter, Sonia, married, in 1920, the Honourable Roland Cubitt, son of the second Baron Ashcombe of the great Cubitt building family. The marriage was happy. The Cubitt grandchildren began arriving in the early 1920s. The eldest of them, Rosalind Maud Cubitt, would be born in 1921. She would, in time, become the mother of Camilla. The First World War passed through these years like a slow, grey storm. The aristocratic class that Alice belonged to was decimated by the Western Front. By the armistice in November 1918, around 1/5 of the male heirs of the British peerage were dead. The country house economy was permanently broken. Death duties, raised again and again during the war, had begun the long sale of the great English estates. The world Alice had grown up in was visibly ending. She watched it end without complaint. In 1925, she made the decision that defined the second half of her life. She and George sold the lease on the London house. They moved their principal residence to Italy. They bought a villa above Florence. They went, by a deliberate choice, into golden exile. That choice was a quiet judgment on the country she was leaving. England was no longer a place in which she could live the life she had been raised to live. Italy still was. The lira was cheap. The Italian aristocracy was crumbling, but had not yet collapsed. The British and American expatriate community in Florence and Tuscany was rich, polite, and large. A villa above the Arno could be staffed by Italian servants at a fraction of what the same standard would cost in London. The food was good. The light was beautiful. The afternoons were long. She climbed the hill above Florence in the autumn of 1925 with what was left of the world she had built. She did not look back. Chapter 10. The Villa Above Florence. In 1925, the Keppels climbed a hill above the Arno and bought a villa with a view of every red roof in Florence. The villa was called the Villa dell'Ombrellino. It stood at Bellosguardo on the southern bank, on a hill that rose steeply from the river. The core of the villa was 16th century. The astronomer Galileo Galilei had lived nearby in the early 1600s and had visited the house. Later owners had added a colonnade and a long terrace facing north toward the city. The roof was red tile. The walls were ochre stucco. The shutters were dark green. The view from the terrace was one of the most famous in Tuscany. From the parapet you could see the whole of central Florence laid out below, the red dome of the Duomo, the campanile of Giotto, the long pale facade of the Palazzo Vecchio, the Arno running through the city, the hills of Fiesole rising on the far side. In the late afternoon, when the light went gold, the city below the villa looked almost too beautiful to be real. Alice and George set about transforming the house. They hired the Anglo-Italian architect Cecil Pinsent, who had laid out the gardens at the Villa Forientati for the art historian Bernard Berenson at Settignano. Pinsent was given the terrace and the gardens. He laid out a long parterre with bisecting pathways, low cypress hedges, ornamental fountains, and stone seats. Alice gave the layout a private name. She called it the Union Jack Garden because the paths crossed in the pattern of the British flag. She had carried her country with her. The interiors were dressed in the same style she had used at 30 Portman Square. Heavy silk damask on the walls, Persian carpets on the floors, French 18th century furniture, silver-framed family photographs on every surface, Fabergé animals in the glass cabinets, orchids in silver tubs, heavy curtains drawn against the Tuscan sun. The world she had built for the king in Mayfair was rebuilt around her in Florence. The king was 20 years dead. The world he had walked into was still there, around the woman who had built it for him. The guest list at the Villa dell'Ombrellino, across the years from 1925 to 1940, reads like a who's who of the exiled European aristocracy and the British expatriate community in Italy. King George II of Greece and Queen Elizabeth, exiled from Athens. King Peter II of Yugoslavia. The exiled Queen Victoria, Eugenie of Spain. The historian and aesthete Harold Acton, who lived nearby at La Pietra. The novelist and aesthete Sir Osbert Sitwell. Sir Winston Churchill on at least one passing visit. The princes of the Sèvres porcelain past. The dukes of the Edwardian past. The deposed kings of the post-war present. They all sat on Alice's terrace. They all looked over the parapet at Florence in the late afternoon. They all took tea from the silver service that had been packed up at Portman Square in 1925 and unpacked here. Alice was now in her late 50s and early 60s. She still wore her hair piled high. She still wore the same silver brooches. She still spoke in the same low, slow voice. Her daughters came to visit. Violet, by now a published novelist, living mostly in Paris, came for the summers. Sonia and Roland Cubitt came for shorter visits, often with the children. The eldest grandchild, Rosalind, would have been about 4 years old when the villa was bought. She would have learnt to walk on Cecil Pinsent's gravel paths. The household ran on a system Alice had perfected in Mayfair and translated into Italian. The major domo was Italian. The cook was Italian. The maids were Italian. The chauffeur was Italian. The gardeners were Italian. They were paid Italian wages, which were lower than English wages. The household ran for a fraction of the cost of an equivalent staff at Portman Square. Alice's investment income, the dividends from the shares Cassel had arranged for her in 1905 and 1907, paid for everything with room to spare. The afternoons were long and slow. The mornings were given to letters. The afternoons were given to receiving callers, walking in the garden, sitting on the terrace, taking tea. The evenings were given to dinner parties on the terrace in summer, in the dining room in winter, always for 12 or 14 guests, always with conversation in 3 languages. In 1933, a small storm broke over the villa. Margot Asquith, the widow of the former Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith, published a volume of memoirs. In it, she described Alice Keppel as the political advisor of the late King Edward. The phrase was carefully chosen and roughly accurate. Alice was furious. She wrote no letter to the press. She gave no interview. She simply spoke to her own circle with controlled anger about Margot's vulgarity in mentioning her by name at all. The episode is one of the few surviving glimpses of what Alice thought about her own legend. She thought, very clearly, that it should not be discussed. She kept up the long ritual of the villa across the 1930s. The summers were hot. The afternoons were beautiful. The guests kept arriving. Outside the gates, in the city below, the dictator Benito Mussolini was tightening his grip on Italian life. The British and American expatriates of Florence began to worry. By the late 1930s, the Italian fascist regime was openly hostile to foreigners. By the spring of 1940, it was clear that Italy was about to enter the European war on the wrong side. The afternoon light still went gold over Florence. The bells of the Duomo still rang. The terrace was still full of orchids. But the long Edwardian afternoon that Alice had carried with her from Mayfair was about to end for the second time, and this time it would not be possible to climb back up the hill and shut the door. Chapter 11. The Ritz Suite and the Florence Grave. In June 1940, she packed 3 suitcases, left a Tuscan villa, and crossed a continent at war to reach a London she barely recognised. Italy entered the European War on the side of Germany on the 10th of June, 1940. By that morning, the Keppels were already preparing to leave. The Italian authorities had begun rounding up British subjects. The American consulate was helping the elderly and the well-connected to evacuate. The Keppels left the Villa dell'Ombrellino in great haste. They could not take the furniture. They could not take the silver. They could not take the orchids. They could not take Cecil Pinson's parterre. They locked the doors. They left a small Italian staff in residence as caretakers. They drove down through Tuscany and into France. They crossed the French border before it closed. They reached the Channel just before the fall of France in late June. They reached London in early July. She was 72 years old. George was 76. They had no London house. The world they had returned to was a country at war, with food rationing, with blackouts, with the Battle of Britain about to begin, with the threat of German invasion across the Channel. They took a suite at the Ritz Hotel on Piccadilly. They settled in to wait the war out. The suite at the Ritz became, by some quiet miracle of habit, a reproduction of the world Alice had built in Mayfair 40 years earlier and rebuilt in Florence 15 years earlier. The same silver-framed photographs went on the side tables. The same orchids appeared in silver tubs, supplied by a faithful Mayfair florist who somehow kept growing them through the Blitz. The same heavy curtains were drawn at 4 o'clock. The same low voice received callers in the late afternoon for tea. The visitors changed. The exiled kings of Europe were now in real exile, not Tuscan exile. King George of Greece was in London. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands was in London. The Yugoslav royal family was in London. The Free French were in London. Alice's drawing room at the Ritz received them all, in turn, across the long years from 1940 to 1945. The war went on. The bombs fell on the city outside. The Ritz kept serving tea. In 1946, when peace returned, the Keppels packed their 3 suitcases again and went back to Italy. The Villa dell'Ombrellino was intact. The Italian staff had kept it through the war. The orchids were dead. The silver had been buried in the garden. Cecil Pinson's parterre was overgrown. The view from the terrace was unchanged. Alice did not have long to enjoy the return. She had been drinking heavily for years. She had been a champagne and brandy woman in Edwardian London, in interwar Florence, and at the Ritz through the war. Her liver, by the time she returned to Italy in 1946, was failing. She knew she was ill. She did not say so. On the 11th of September, 1947, at the Villa dell'Ombrellino, Alice Keppel died. The cause was cirrhosis of the liver. She was 79. The last person to see her alive was her elder daughter Violet, who had come down from Paris to be with her. The funeral was simple. She was buried at the Cimitero degli Allori, the Protestant cemetery on the southern outskirts of Florence, where so many of the English and American expatriates of the long Florentine afternoon had been buried before her. George Keppel followed her 10 weeks later. He died on the 22nd of November 1947 of a stroke. He was 83. He was buried beside her at the Cimitero degli Allori. Their graves are still there. The villa passed to Violet, who lived in it until her own death in February 1972. After Violet's death, the villa was sold. It has since been restored as a private event venue for weddings and corporate functions. The terrace is still there. The view is still the same. Cecil Pinsent's pattern of paths can still be walked. The obituaries in the English newspapers in September 1947 were careful and respectful. They mentioned that she had been a noted Edwardian society hostess. They mentioned the Villa dell'Ombrellino. They did not mention King Edward by name. The Times noted, in a single line buried near the end of its notice, that she had been a confidant of the late king. That was all. The discretion had held, even into her obituary. She had outlived her king by 37 years. She had outlived the Edwardian period by 37 years. She had outlived the British Empire's pre-war confidence. She had outlived the British country house economy. She had outlived almost every other figure of any importance from the world she had operated in. And she had outlived them on her own terms, in a villa above Florence, with the same orchids on the mantelpieces and the same family photographs on the side tables. What she had not outlived, although she could not have known it, was the pattern itself. The pattern was about to come back, one final time, in the next generation, but one. The mechanism was already at work in the children of her daughter Sonia. The pattern was about to repeat. Chapter 12. The Pattern That Refused to Die. In 1947, a journalist could have written that the Edwardian royal mistress had ended forever with the woman buried in Florence, and he would have been wrong by exactly 56 years. He would not have known. Nobody could have known. The two key elements of the next iteration of the pattern were a 6-year-old girl in Sussex called Camilla Rosemary Shand, and a 13-month-old baby in Buckingham Palace, who would in time become the Prince of Wales. Trace the line. Alice Keppel's younger daughter Sonia had married Roland Cubitt in 1920. They had 3 children. The eldest was Rosalind Maud Cubitt, born in 1921. Rosalind married Bruce Shand, a young army officer, in 1946. Their first child, Camilla, was born on the 17th of July, 1947, in London. Alice Keppel was at that moment alive at the Villa dell'Ombrellino, 2 months from her death. Whether she ever held the great-granddaughter who would in time match her own career, no record states. The likelihood is that she did not. Camilla was 8 weeks old when Alice died. Camilla grew up at the Lanes, a country house in Sussex, in the careful, prosperous post-war world of the English upper-middle aristocracy. She was sent to Montfertil in Switzerland. She was sent to finishing school. She came out as a debutante in 1965. She was, by all reliable accounts of her contemporaries, charming, funny, well-bred, sporting, and discreet. She was reputed, in her own circle, to be very proud of her great-grandmother. She mentioned the connection, lightly and often, to friends in the 1960s and 1970s. She is said to have remarked at parties that her great-grandmother had been the mistress of King Edward VII. She is said to have added that it might be a family pattern. She met Prince Charles, eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II and heir to the British throne, in 1970. She was 22. He was 21. They were briefly involved. Charles went to sea with the Royal Navy. Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, a Brigade of Guards officer of impeccable lineage, in 1973. She continued to see Charles socially. She was a regular at the country house weekends he attended. She was at the polo matches he played in. She was, by the late 1970s, the woman to whom the Prince of Wales most consistently returned. He married Diana Spencer in 1981. The marriage failed publicly across the 1980s and into the 1990s. The affair with Camilla, by the early 1990s, was an open secret in the British press. The Camilla and Charles relationship was, by then, exactly the kind of arrangement that Alice and Bertie had operated through the late 1890s and the 1900s. A long-term, close devoted bond between a prince and a married woman, conducted in country houses, tolerated by intimates, ignored by the official histories, and protected by the silence of the people around it. The two cases are not identical. There is one large difference. Camilla and Charles eventually married in 2005 after the death of his first wife and the dissolution of her own. Alice and Bertie never could have. The crown had moved on, in the intervening century, in the matter of what a Prince of Wales could marry. But the deeper pattern is the same kind of woman, from broadly the same kind of family, with broadly the same temperament, became the great companion of broadly the same kind of prince. The pattern repeated itself 100 years later through the same female line. When Queen Elizabeth II died in September 2022, Prince Charles became King Charles III. Camilla Parker Bowles became Queen Camilla. She was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of May, 2023. The date is worth pausing on. The 6th of May. The same date on which her great-grandmother had walked up to the side entrance of Buckingham Palace with a letter in her bag, 113 years earlier. There is no record that the date was chosen for that reason. The coincidence is real. The pattern, watching the calendar, is exact. What does it mean? It means that a kind of woman, raised in a particular kind of family, with a particular kind of discretion, has been the unofficial partner of the British monarchy for at least 125 years and counting. The names change, the constitutional details change, the newspapers change, the discretion remains. The pattern of the well-born confidant who absorbs the king's tiredness, listens without interrupting, mentions the right thing at the right moment, and never under any circumstances speaks to a journalist, has outlasted the British Empire, the country house economy, the decline of the aristocracy, 2 world wars, the welfare state, the common market, the loss of the colonies, the abolition of hereditary peers, and the rise of the tabloid press. It is, on inspection, one of the most durable institutions in modern British public life. It does not appear in any constitutional textbook. It has no statute. It has no name. But it has, twice now in measurable history, produced the woman who actually held the king's attention. Alice Keppel built the modern version of the role. She built it through 12 years of late afternoons in a Mayfair drawing room. She built it through the absolute discipline of her household, her husband, her daughters, and herself. She built it through a refusal to ask for what she received, a refusal to write down what she heard, and a refusal to speak about what she remembered. She built it through her exit, in which she left the country quietly, lived for 37 years in beautiful, ignored privacy, and died without ever once breaking her silence. She built it well enough that the line she founded would, a century after her death, return to occupy the same role beside another Prince of Wales. The lesson her life leaves us with is hard. It is that the visible British Constitution, the textbook one, the one with Parliament and Cabinet and Crown, has always run alongside an invisible one, made of friendships and habits and shared rooms, in which the real decisions of court life have been made by people whose names will not appear in any history book. The visible constitution survives because the invisible one does. Alice Keppel was the invisible constitution at its highest function. She was the woman the king would actually listen to. She gave that to him for 12 years. She paid for it with her own privacy. She kept the silence to the end. And the pattern she built has lasted. That is the part of the story the official histories tend not to record. That is the kind of buried inheritance this channel exists to dig out. So if a story like this is what you came for, Please subscribe so the next one finds you. And in the comments, tell me where in the world you are watching from, and whether you think the Camilla coincidence is the deliberate completion of a family pattern, or just the strangest accident in modern royal history. I read them all.